Hi, hello, good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to have you all here. Today, we have one more event of our series of workshops, the permanent workshop in legal philosophy, ethics, and politics. And today, it's a huge pleasure to have with us Professor Matthias Mahlmann. Professor Mahlmann, he's currently the president of the IVR, the most important association for legal and social philosophy in the world. He was just recently a researcher at the Bonavero Institute for Human Rights at the University of Oxford. He's currently the chair of Theory of Law, Legal Sociology, and International Public Law at the University of Zurich, and also was a visiting professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., and at the Turkish-German University in Istanbul. He was also visiting at the University of Pennsylvania, and he had many fellowships and positions across Europe. Professor Mahlmann's research interests are mostly on human rights and the philosophy of human rights. And today, he's going to talk to us about the topic of human knowledge and human rights, the political epistemology of justice and dignity. So, once more, it's a huge pleasure to have you all here. It's a huge pleasure to have Professor Mahlmann here with us. And without further ado, Professor Mahlmann, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's very kind of you that you spent your day, or at least part of it, coming to this lecture and listening to what I'm going to say. I always, I think, insist that it's too rash to say it's a great pleasure to welcome a speaker before one has heard the speaker, because the reality may be of a kind that reduces this pleasure considerably. It's my, as I said, great honor to be here and to exchange a few ideas with you about, I think, a very important topic. And let me start with this gentleman, the Danish Prince Hamlet. As you know, he was unhappy about his experience at the corrupted court of Denmark. And even though he admired human beings, he came to the conclusion, man delights not me. And if you look at the current situation of the world, you may wonder whether this appreciation of the political situation in one of the greatest tragedies of world history is not more than just a bile and mood of a melancholic intellectual. We are facing unprecedented global challenges, ecological, economical. The scourge of war has risen its head again, and we do that in a particular political framework of consolidated authoritarianisms around the world. And not only that, there are new forms of authoritarianisms who have established themselves often behind a democratic facade. And perhaps most worrying of all these developments, there are tendencies of the self-destruction of democracies and human rights cultures, epitomized by the storm on the Capitol in Washington, but also documented by other developments. For example, the rise of the extreme right in Germany. Here you see a picture of the many, literally millions of people in Germany demonstrating against it. And also other countries had experiences about it. Here a picture about events you all know more about than I do. I think these attacks against human rights must be resisted because of the intrinsic value of human rights and democracy, but also because authoritarianisms are not a reliable source for politics that are actually serving the common interests of humanity. So the starting point of my analysis is that the protection of basic human rights and democracy is as urgent as ever, but that at the same time, the political, theoretical, and also philosophical base of human rights is in concrete danger of eroding. There are various forms of human rights revisionism and skepticism around. There are people who argue that human rights are nothing else but a contingent product of a particular epoch, perhaps also of a particular culture. People doubt the political rationale of human rights, for example, by arguing that human rights crowd out other important political concerns. People in philosophy doubt that human rights have really a convincing basis in normative theory. And there is a new challenge for moral psychology, cognitive and neuroscience. I'm going to talk about more in a few seconds. So for some people, the twilight of human rights has come, and some people gleefully welcome this development. There's in particular a new kid on the block coming from current moral psychology and neuroscience. From this perspective, basic moral intuitions are nothing but the product of skewed human thinking. The processes of moral cognition that produce these moral judgments are not sources to provide real insight, but on the contrary, structurally create errors. So from a certain perspective, the problem, the idea, the nightmare of the malign demon reappears. René Descartes wondered about. You may all know, as philosophy and theory students, that one of the questions that Descartes discussed in his epistemology was whether it is imaginable that we are constructed in a way by a malign demon that what we think is true is actually false. From a certain perspective, therefore, the nightmare of the epistemology of modernity reappears now in the framework of neuro and cognitive science, because they argue, some of these authors argue that this malign demon resides in the very architecture of our cognitive machinery. I think these attacks, and that is important to remember, are undermining democracies because rights are central elements of the architecture of democracy, because they create the space for political action that is essential for democracies. And the human rights are also part of the justificatory base of human rights, of democracy, and therefore any attack on human rights is also an attack on democracy. It seems to me that the struggle against these new forms of authoritarianism will not be won without a compelling idea of human rights, because they will formulate one of the aims for such struggle. So the problem is how to get a grip on the problem. And one of the ways to proceed is basically to look at human rights from below. So this is a picture from people struggling against the destruction of democracy in Hong Kong, movement, as you know, by now crushed. These are women fighting against the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. This is a picture from the early phase of the Taliban rule, where such demonstrations were still possible. Here's a picture from the resistance against the junta in Myanmar. It's too small, the presentation here, so you can't read it, but this placard here has one of my favorite slogans. It says, "Democracy is more important than husbands." This is why they wear these wedding dresses, and please check for yourself whether that is true. And as I see lots of men here, perhaps also whether it's more important than wives. It's an interesting question whether there's a symmetry here in that respect. Here's a picture of women fighting against the rape culture in India, and here an iconic picture from the resistance of Iranian people against the lack of freedoms in Iran. There's a new challenge around, which is also important, and that is the rights of future generations and what may be called the diachronic universality of human rights, which I think is a very interesting challenge, because we have to consider human rights not only in our current time, but also in this other future-related perspective. So the interesting, I think, observation, it's just an empirical observation, is that human rights activism shows that for many people around the world, and irrespective of religion and culture, is not a question, but actually a reason for often quite courageous action. And then the question is, why is that so? Why are they motivated in that way? What's the source of the charisma of human rights, if you would like to formulate it this way? Why are people attracted? Why do they think it's so important? I would like to answer these questions by trying to defend 5 theses. The first thesis is that human rights have actually deep roots in history, and that doesn't mean that you are engaged in some kind of anachronism, nor that you are pursuing some teleological account of history, or even propose a theodicy in disguise. It's also not an example of a deplorable backward projection of current ideas in order to legitimize them. And I think the central point is really to understand that if you want to write a real history of human rights, you must include phenomena that are not explicit human rights, but actually embody the basic intuitions that are necessary to build this idea. The second thesis is that there are sufficient justificatory resources, and the 3 central elements of this is a theory of human goods, a political theory of the existence conditions of human flourishing, and a set of well-defined normative principles, including justice, solidarity, and human dignity. My third thesis is that neither psychology nor cognitive neuroscience nor evolutionary theory provide any reason to doubt the idea that we are capable, because of our cognitive machinery, to come up with some kind of justified idea of human rights. So no particular results and insights from human moral psychology undermine the idea of human rights. And on the contrary, and I will try to map that out at the end of this talk, there are interesting, I think, constructive possibilities to actually show that you can account for basic human moral intuitions in a way that paves the way to understand deeper what human rights are about. Importantly, I think, if one engages with this kind of question, you understand not only something about this particular element of human rights, but you understand something about ourselves, about us as human beings. It seems to me that in the image reflected by the idea of human rights, the normative aspirations of human beings, you can discern the contours of a life form that may teach us some surprising things about the kind of creatures we are. And fifth, I think democracy and political economy, political autonomy will not survive without a convincing idea of human rights. As we are here in a prestigious law faculty, you all know that the law of human rights is protected by multiple layers: national, constitutional, regional, and international. A central catalyst for the mandatory international human rights regime is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, was promoted by a key actor, namely, at that time, democratic and post-colonial Jamaica. That brings me to an important point, namely the crucial role of the Global South in human rights history. One example I would like to mention is the crucial role of the Global South and certain actors in the drafting process of the Universal Declaration. There are many such influences, especially by Latin American scholars and jurists. Here is one that refers to the gender-neutral language in Article 1 and the preamble of the Universal Declaration. And these 2 women were responsible for that. That is Lakshmi Menon and Hansa Mehta, and both delegates of India, who struggled and successfully struggled to include in the preamble an explicit reference to the rights of man and woman and a gender-neutral formulation in Article 1. I guess we are all familiar with. This person you may all recognize as well, that is Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually opposed these ideas of gender-neutral language, here discussing with Hansa Mehta. In this context, I think it's also important to remember what I would like to call colonial relativism. Colonial relativism, in my terminology, is a selective application of human rights by imperial states to themselves, but not to colonies. That debate had its legal manifestation in so-called colonial application clauses, both in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in the European context in the European Convention on Human Rights. These debates were to a certain degree successful in the UN Charter, though rather hidden, and explicitly so in the European Convention, even though these norms are now not relevant anymore. They were not successful in the case of the Universal Declaration, because in the case of the Universal Declaration, the colonial powers, the European colonial powers, had not that much of an influence and less of an interest, because the Universal Declaration, as you all know, was not mandatory international law. The background of this was an often explicit racist relativism, namely the basic idea that people in the global south were not developed enough to actually need and enjoy human rights. An interesting further chapter in this context is the brutal suppression of anti-colonial movements around the world, often apparently forgotten, from Vietnam to Algeria, from Malaya to Kenya. An example that there's a growing conscience of that period and the role of European states is perhaps this year. That's King Charles, who visited Kenya and acknowledged, that's a quote by King Charles, the abhorrent colonial violence, but refrained from apologizing for it. In this period, universal human rights were an inspiration, demands, an idea, a guiding idea of decolonization, not something imposed by European powers on the world. Another interesting thing I think we have to remember to have some kind of realistic concept, what we are talking about is the tragic history of post-colonial dictatorships. Here my examples include the Shah in Iran, Idi Amin from Uganda, and Pinochet from Chile. This kind of, I think, idea is, of course, an antidote to global South romanticism. It also helps us, I think, to remember that there is a profound danger to dissociate the right to self-determination from human rights. It also, I think, is a reminder that relativism can be turned into an ideology of power, both by weakening the critique from internal actors as from external authors. Perhaps most importantly for my purpose, these examples show that there is a trap to be avoided, and that is the trap of depoliticizing human rights. What was important about the Shah, Idi Amin and Pinochet was not their Iranian, Ugandan or Chilean identity. What was important about these people was their politics. More precisely, them being prepared to actually establish rather ruthless dictatorships. And I think it's a central insight that it is a fault to depoliticize the deeply political project of human rights. If one avoids this trap, I think one rediscovers something very important, namely the critical normative thinking of individuals, which can become a moving power of history. If you, by the way, wonder why my PowerPoint slides are slightly disorganized, violating basic standards of Swiss organization, and the reason is that they are running through this computer, and as I knew in advance, this always leads that they are kind of strangely positioned, and secondly, that the effects are not reproduced as they would have been on my computer. So this I have to say to protect my national honor of an organized Swiss law professor. Another, I think, important element of what we are talking about is to widen our perspective and, in particular, travel down a bit deeper the wells of time. And that includes in paying attention to the voices of the victims of human rights abuses. So that is important to avoid the whitewashing of history, for example, by remembering these human beings. These are the survivors of the first, according to most accounts, first genocide of the 20th century in the narrow technical sense of the Genocide Convention. It was perpetrated by German colonial troops in 1904, what is now Namibia, against the Nama and Herero. And they were driven into a desert with the explicit intent to extinguish these people and led there to die, and a few people survived, which were then incarcerated. These are examples of that. So my question now is the following, and that is a very, I think, important question. What is our assumption about what was going on in these people under these circumstances? Are we assuming that they just felt the physical pain of being starved in the desert? Or were they reconstructing what happened to them also in normative terms? They certainly were not talking the language of human rights. But was there something in their perception that, for example, told them that their death was not only painful, but unjust? The same question can be asked in other contexts. Here's another example, a statement from a slave woman who was freed in then still colonial Gambia, and who brought a claim, a suit to a colonial court. What you are now reading is not the verbatim voice of this slave woman, but what was included in the court protocols. So it's filtered, but I think you still will get the point of what she was saying. Yaling Dabo, she said and testified, "It was against my wish that prisoner came to me at night. Being a slave, I was afraid. I was a prisoner as a slave. Nobody has put the word slave into my mouth. Prisoner himself used to tell us that we were his slaves. That is all the reason I have for saying I am a slave. It is not because I was beaten that I say that I am a slave. All the world beats, not because I make rice farms. If you are in the hands of a person, if you are pre-born, you will know." I guess everybody in this room understands what the reality is behind these words. It was against my wish that prisoner came to me at night. So the question is again, what are our assumptions about these persons? Most probably illiterate, surely unfamiliar with any human rights idea, surely unfamiliar with any kind of legal philosophy on human rights. What was she talking about, and what are our assumptions about her? And the questions are very important, and therefore I spelled them out, even though I have the vague suspicion that you in the last row can't read them because the projection is very small. So the question is, what does she feel? And in particular, does Yaling Dabo's testimony simply report the brute fact of harm, or is there perhaps a normative dimension to her suffering? Did she think in whatever terms that she could justifiably demand that this not happen, and that the slaveholder was bound not to rape her, even though the customs of a slave society were on his side? What are the reasons why this is naturally assumed for a European woman in this time, but not for her? Conversely, what are the reasons to think that the experience and evaluation of both African and European women share crucial common elements? Does rape only constitute a normatively evaluated harm after a cultural development comparable to that of Europe? What about Dabo's longing for freedom? Did it have a normative dimension, or was it just a non-normative wish, like I wish I could fly? If you think that it is implausible and perhaps even tainted by racist prejudice to think that this woman's suffering was devoid of rich inner feelings and in particular certain moral ideas, then there's a very important question to be answered, namely, what exactly is the moral world like? How does it look like in human beings? What kind of moral concepts existed? And how did they experience the European barbarity these people were exposed to? But it seems quite clear, I think, that it's a wrong assumption to assume that these people are just moral blank slates. So if you study the history of human rights along these lines, I think you will identify certain building blocks of human rights. And that includes substantial content, for example, the idea of freedom, but perhaps also other things, material preconditions for dignity of life, but also, and that is perhaps interesting for technically sophisticated legal theorists, the concept of subjective rights or claim rights. If you read the literature, you will find sometimes the hypothesis that subjective rights, the category, this is a formal category, not human rights, subjective rights as such, in the writing of the glossators or the commentators of the rediscovered Roman law in medieval Italy. I think that is an untenable idea. There are lots of documents of rights in law and culture in the antiquity, and not only in the antiquity that has left written testimonies, but also in other societies, indigenous societies, and the global south. They may be implicit or explicit, but certainly they are not the white man's privilege, to paraphrase an infamous colonial quote, but the heritage, it seems to me, of humankind. One problem that the history and the practice of human rights and also the doctrine of human rights is facing is the problem of exclusion and inclusion. So human rights are notoriously incomplete and exclude certain groups of people. I give you two examples of historical predecessors that actually did not include certain justified rights and implausibly included others. As you will know, John Locke wrote an admirable treatise on freedom of religion and religious tolerance, but excluded atheists from protection, which in any human rights doctrine today are obviously included. The hugely influential scholar, natural law scholar, Elmer de Wattel, who had a direct impact on the drafting of the Universal Declaration, on the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, included the right to abduct women under conditions of a necessity to continue the procreation of a certain community, though not a right to rape and forced marriage. I guess we all agree that that is not a very plausible candidate for a human right today. And we all know that throughout history, all kinds of people were excluded, non-aristocrats, women, people of a certain skin color, religious creeds, and so on. So in standard histories of human rights, you will find the comment that a document, for example, like the Magna Carta, is not really something that is interesting for the history of human rights, but is nothing but the settlement of interests of social oligarchies, political elite groups among themselves. But you also know that this discussion about inclusion hasn't ended. For example, the rights of prenatal life of embryos, fetuses are highly controversial. To my surprise, during the pandemic, at least in many countries, I don't know about Brazil, suddenly there was a serious discussion whether the rights of elderly people diminish by age, which I personally found rather shocking. But that is also a question that is very seriously debated. And you all know that the rights of non-human animals are also of great concern. So what do we learn from this? I think there's an important point here to understand. And I would like to quote here one of the most important voices of human rights law of the 20th century, namely Herschel Lauterbach, who commented on this in the following way. The historic value, he said, of any single pronouncement affirming the rights of man as against authority is not dependent on the degree of its completeness. And that tells us something very important, that by including certain privileged elites in rights catalogs, you set an example and you provoke a question. Namely, why are these rights only protected for them? Why are they not protected for all? And this is why the privileges of a few can historically spearhead the rights for all. So as far as I'm concerned, if you want to write a true history of human rights, you have to have a rather complex idea, which includes phenomena that are not human rights, but cultural manifestations of these ideas, including the implications of human struggles. That will lead you, I think, to my first thesis, namely that human rights have deep roots in human history, not as human rights catalogs in cuneiform, but basically as claims of common moral understanding to a just share to existential human goods, such as liberty, equality, and respect, slowly transformed into explicit human rights. The building blocks are concrete moral judgments, which are first formulated in abstract terms, then objectified as to the content, generalized over persons, generalized over cases, universalized over persons, and then made explicit. And if that is the case, the explicit concept of human rights is born after many centuries of thought and struggle, backlash, the passionate pursuit of wild ideas, forgetfulness, and of course, self-destructive human action. My next point is normative theory, and I would like to argue that there are three pillars of justificatory theory, namely anthropology, political theory, and normative principles. The first thing that you have to understand is that theory of human goods, I think, is a necessary element of any theory of human rights. Human rights don't protect everything. They are selective, and rightly so. So you need also some kind of threshold condition. And that threshold condition is, I think, very important. It is very nice if somebody serves chocolate cake to your office every afternoon, but unfortunately, even in Switzerland, there is no human rights to have chocolate cake served to your office. And the reason is that that doesn't cross the threshold condition necessary for a theory of human rights. There's also a necessary anthropological base. So we need basically some working assumptions about normatively relevant, universally shared characteristics of human beings. So if you're talking about the right of women and girls to education, you have to make an argument that girls and women actually need education to grow and flourish. If you're talking about human rights, bodily integrity, you have to argue that beating, humiliation, any kind of abuse is as painful in any part of the world as in others, including Sao Paulo and the fancy Kreis 4, a part of Zurich. I hope I will sometimes see you. I'm not cool enough to go there, but when I look around here, you are clearly the guys who have a drink there. What is also important, apart from these kind of interests, is liberty and the taste of autonomy. Liberty has an instrumental value, for example, to enable human development. It also has an intrinsic value. It seems to at least be a lesson of history that human beings flourish under conditions of freedom and wither under oppressive regimes. I think also equality is important in this context. I'm sure you're all painfully aware of the strange desire of human beings to feel to be something better than other human beings, from the petty hierarchies of professional life to the power struggles of political societies, and of course the great struggles for hegemony in world history. But there's also something intrinsically appealing, I think, in orders of equality. So there is, I think, the lure of power, but there's also something like the subversive spell of equality. Social struggles are not only about material goods and freedom and equality, but they are also about recognition. It is about, I think, the desire of human beings to be recognized as something important and worthy. And I think that is part of what I call here an existential and egalitarian pride, derived of nothing else than being human. Let me now turn to the political theory of human rights and explain shortly what perhaps the political point of human rights could be. Human rights, and I would like to emphasize this, are not solving all problems, nor were they ever meant to. They are constructed to provide security for certain central goods, but that doesn't mean that all the political problems we have should be solved or could be solved by human rights. I think that's rather obvious. Human rights are certainly not handmaidens of power or an impediment to what is called post-colonial world-making, because human rights limit power, and at least to me it seems that the lesson of post-colonial dictatorships have told us that there is no legitimate post-colonial world-making without the protection of human rights. What human rights are therefore is the ethical and legal entrenchment of the protection of certain goods. And from a law perspective, this entrenchment is specifically qualified because of the necessities of law, for example, that these rights are justiciable. These rights ultimately empower human beings to be subjects of their personal lives and history. And I think important to emphasize is also that these rights are not an impediment, but a precondition of community. Please remember that rights create substantial normative burdens. The moment you accept a right for yourself, you also accept the rights of others. And that means you accept duties that you have, which can be very substantial in a community where rights are really protected equally. So it seems to me that rights embody this respect, which is a precondition for any community that deserves its name. I don't know what you as students of history regard as the main lesson of the 20th century. For me, it's the following. The main lesson of the 20th century is a simple one. Namely, human beings are ready to inflict any harm on other human beings. They always have been to inflict any harm on other human beings, and they always will be ready to inflict any harm on other human beings. To put it in the words of the great Russian author Wassily Grossman, who was one of the first who actually entered a concentration camp in the course of their liberation by the Red Army in the Second World War. We must remember, he said, that fascism and racism will emerge from this war not only with the bitterness of defeat, but also with sweet memories of the ease with which it is possible to commit mass murder. It seems to me that any respect for human beings is fragile, threatened by the unbecoming forces residing in the labyrinthian selves of human beings, and which can be unleashed by human political actors and certain political structures. So it seems to me that no political order is legitimate that does not respect the basic rights of individuals. My next point concerns the normative elements that are necessary to provide some kind of justificatory theory of rights. First one is justice as equality, the idea that there's a prima facie equal right of human beings to the common heritage of humanity. As you all know, concepts of equality are contested. There are questions whether equality is formal, substantial, procedural, transformative, whether equality equals non-domination or something else. But it seems to me that there is a common core, and that common core can, I think, be approached by looking at differentiated proportional equality, which relies on certain criteria of distribution in different spheres of distribution. Therefore, I'm sure also at this faculty of law, good grades are awarded for good performance. Social benefits hopefully are provided for people in need. And hopefully also people acknowledge that taxes should be based on ability of people, and therefore higher taxes, proportionally higher taxes are justified. These criteria of distribution can be specified by instrumental, honorific criteria, and the intrinsic worth of human beings. That would be something we would have to spell out in a detailed discussion about some kind of question of justice. And the background is the idea of the strict equality of the worth of human beings, which I think sets a limit to the possible scope of legitimate differentiations. And therefore, only an equal system of rights is a legitimate system of rights. My next point, my next normative principle is solidarity, so the duty to care for the goods and rights of others. So you may now be bored because this talk is particularly disappointing. You may fight against this boredom by using your computer to do interesting internet researches or write something into your chats, which entertains you a bit more than this talk. But even if that is the case, I think if I collapse now, you may be happy that this talk has ended, but you may still feel the duty to pick up your phone and call an ambulance. So, and I think that kind of basic duty of solidarity exists. And as we are talking in the case of human rights about very basic goods, I think this duty of solidarity extends to the protection of the enjoyment of these goods of other human beings. And as rights themselves are a central asset, that is also important to justify that we have the duties of solidarity to do something for the protection of these goods by the particular instrument of rights. My next principle, which I think is central, is dignity. I think in any theory of human rights, you have to come up with some kind of account of the worth of human beings. I use the common term dignity here. And the reason is that by human rights, you protect the goods of human beings. So if the being whose goods you are trying to protect is worthless in itself, as some pessimist philosophies have asserted, then the project of human rights doesn't make any sense. And I think there are reasons for that. This is not a lecture on human dignity, but I would like at least to hint at two central arguments that may help us. First of all, I think human life is an intrinsic good for every human being. That creates, I think, a claim under principles of justice to the possibility to enjoy this intrinsic good throughout one's life. If one universalizes this particular claim, I think this idea, this thought, legitimizes a universal right of everybody to be regarded as an end in oneself. The second point is derived from the axiological consequences of the human form of life. Human beings have not so pleasant sides, but we are, after all, I would say, thinking, understanding, feeling, creative, mortal, free and responsible beings under moral laws. And I think this form of life merits the description of dignity. As I said at the beginning, I think it's a great error just to look at explicit testimonies of the idea of human rights, but you also have to look at its implicit expressions. And I would like to present you now just shortly some examples of what I mean, and I use the example of art. So here's, for example, a figure from pre-Columbian art, a smiling, thoughtful person who may tell us something, both because it was created and there were at least one human being there who had this kind of vision of human life, but also because of what is created here, the image that we see, that this may illustrate what I'm talking about when I say that we have a very particular form of life. If you go to the next World Congress of the IVR, which I warmly recommend, you will encounter this pensive bodhisattva in the National Museum of Korea as one of its main pieces. I think it's a striking example because what you see here is a certain element of Buddhist thought, namely that you are catching the moment of understanding something deep, and it's a moment of joy. I'm very sure here at the law faculty, understanding something creates equally this moment of joy. And I think that tells us something, again, very important about human beings, namely that our relation to the world is the relation not of an object, but of a subject that creates a profound and even happiness-creating picture of the world. My last example is contemporary by the street artist Banksy. He painted this piece on a bombed house in the Ukraine, and obviously trying to celebrate the ability of human beings to display human grace, even under the conditions of war and destruction. My last main point is now what I called the new kid on the block, namely moral psychology, neuroscience, and related research perspectives. So the task that we have to face, I think, is a substantial one. It is a substantial scientific task to try to actually develop a theory of how moral and legal understanding works. This task requires, to say it with the words of John Locke, arts and pains, because the understanding, like the eye, makes us see and perceive all other things, takes no notice of itself. We are not transparent to ourselves. We don't know how we think. We have to discover the ways our understanding works. You may all be familiar with Wittgenstein's famous saying that all problems of philosophy are basically the products of the bewitching of language. And to a certain degree, as I said at the beginning, certain very influential voices in cognitive science and moral psychology today tell us that we are also bewitched, that our moral judgment is basically the product of skewed structures of our moral cognition. I would like to explain that with one very influential example. It is based in the dual process theory of the human mind. You all know people who formulated that theory got a Nobel Prize in economics. But this is something that is working within this framework. The idea is that the ontological principles, including human rights, are, in a technical sense, that's not my term, that's their term, cognitive illusion. And they are generated by certain brain areas which are associated with emotional control, here concretely the vitromedial prefrontal cortex. Human rights are, from that perspective, post hoc rationalizations. So the stuff you're doing here in public law is not really an intellectual, rationally controlled endeavor, but you're just rationalizing your gut reactions without knowing it. Necessarily so, because you're constructed in that way. The alternative, according to these voices, is utilitarianism. That is supposed to be rationalism. And also neuroimaging studies, they argue, show that utilitarian thinking is rooted in brain regions associated with cognitive control, here the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The problem is that there is various contradicting empirical evidence, not least if you are applying some kind of convincing theoretical framework, including an analysis of the famous trolley problem, which is at the base of core papers in this area. If you do that, you will discover, and I will say more about it in a minute, that there are other elements operating here. And that is important also to interpret what actually these neuroimaging results concretely mean. Secondly, this theory is self-refuting. As I think any serious student of utilitarianism knows, utilitarianism has non-utilitarian foundations, namely the deontological principle of equality. You need a normative principle that tells you that you actually should treat the happiness of every person equally. And that is a non-consequentialist precondition of consequentialism. So what does that mean now for this theory? Well, if they say that this kind of utilitarian thinking is rational, but at the base of this supposedly rational thinking are these emotional gut reactions, namely the deontological principles. Utilitarianism itself loses its claim to rationality. If they say deontology is actually then rational because it has to be the foundation, or it is the foundation of utilitarianism, their theory also collapses because the basic tenet is refuted by the consequences of the argument of these people themselves. So what's a better way forward? I said that at the beginning that I have a constructive proposal to make, and I call it here a mentalist theory of ethics of law. So a theory of moral cognition, but an alternative theory of moral cognition, which is based on a very important observation, namely that our moral judgments are the product of a structural analysis of intentions and actions over abstract categories. And these include agency, internal states like purpose or knowledge, consequences of our intended actions, and others. These cognitive processes, after the structural analysis, ascribes a normative status, morally right, wrong, just, unjust, to a selective set of possible objects of moral evaluation. For example, you evaluate an intention to help as being morally good. This normative status ascribed has volitional and emotional consequences. For example, you may feel the experience, you may feel the obligation to help somebody, or you may feel shame if you haven't done it. To give you an example, this happened not long ago in the center of Zurich, not far away from where I live. It's not a picture I made, because you may wonder why I make a picture instead of helping what was going on. No, that is just a picture from the news. So there was a driver in a car, collapsed, and the car drove over a bridge in the Limmat. That's the local river of Zurich. This is where the French mineral water companies go and fill their water bottles to sell it to naive Brazilians as the true water of the French Alps. So people jumped in and to help this person, to drag him out and save his life. So the question is, what is the process of, for example, going on in these people when they are deciding to act or not to act? And I would propose what is going on here for them and also for us, slightly modified, but principally in the same way. When we observe this and try to find out how we evaluate their actions, to run through this structural analysis and the categories that I just named. So we may ask whether this is actually an action, or whether there is agency, whether it was a voluntary and volitionally controlled act. If somebody just jumps into, falls into the Limmat, that is certainly not then the basis for some kind of moral appreciation of this act. What about the intentions? Was there an intention to help, and did it have beneficial consequences? And importantly, it was the direct intention to help, or was it the direct intention to do something else? Perhaps the people just wanted to show off to their girlfriend, boyfriend, and had no particular desire to have really this person's in the car. If the latter is the case, I think our moral evaluation of this action drastically changes. We apply certain moral principles, for example, altruism, and then experience volitional and emotional consequences. For example, if you're standing there and can jump in, the obligation to actually do something to save this person. So to put it a bit more abstractly, that is, I would propose what is going on in this context. This is not by me here. This mountain, don't think that's a reference to the Swiss Alps. That is just a sign this computer just created, interestingly. So that is basically the process that is going on in moral cognition. It's a structural analysis to ascertain that it's action, the kind of intentions. Then you have a description, a specific description of the action. For example, an altruistic action. You have a moral evaluation of this altruistic action, namely as being something morally good. And then it has consequences, both volitionally and emotionally. So human moral cognition is constituted of certain normative categories like agency, duty, and rights. it opens a certain specific cognitive space, including what is called normative qualia, so internal states experienced in a certain specific manner from a subjective point of view and accessible by introspection. It is limited to a certain set of possible objects, intentions, actions, feelings, state of affairs based on intentional actions, I guess, are included. My decision to start my Sunday hike to the Swiss Alps with my left foot and not my right foot clearly is not a possible object of evaluation. And there are substantial principles, justice, altruism, and I think also respect for human beings and non-instrumentalization, and that is, I would submit, the real lesson of the famous trolley problems. This is not a speculative theory, it's a thick theory, a refutable theory, and there are all kinds of possible counter-evidence and evidence. For example, the analysis of moral judgment, experiments that you can conduct, and very importantly, child psychology. As you all will know, it's, I would say, impossible to assume that, given what we know about child psychology and the development of moral concepts, to assume that even small children, pre-verbal children, have no access to moral concepts. My last point, you may wonder whether I'm breaking Hume's law not to derive normative statements from his. I would submit I don't do that because my normative argument is not based on psychological facts. But there are three central elements to actually identify the benefits of a theory of moral cognition of this kind. First of all, it would be a great scientific achievement to come up with some kind of explanatory theory of moral cognition. That is a defining element of human life, and to understand something about it would be deeply interesting. Secondly, I think we urgently need the tools to criticize unconvincing psychological theories and distinguish sound psychology from perhaps politically unbecoming ideology. And third, I think this kind of research may help to draw the contours of a life form in which humans are reasoning, moral sentient, self-conscious, autonomous, self-seeking beings yearning for justice, respect, and recognition. So my message is mixed. I think human beings are terrible and remarkable, and human rights are the modest attempt to prevent the terrible and enable the remarkable. And as far as I'm concerned, progress can only be justified within the normative boundaries of human rights, because human rights keep the door open to better worlds and may help to prevent the worst that very well may lay ahead of our species. This is a painting with which I want to finish by the famous Flemish painter Peter Bruegel. It illustrates a saying, the blind lead the blind to an abyss. My hope is that human rights can contribute to a future where this is just the illustration of a proverb and not the summary of world history, a history in which the blind lead the blind to the abyss of the ultimate destruction of this species. Thank you very much. And if I may, thank you very much. Thank you very much that even you stayed on. Just one remark, this is based, as you know, and have heard in the thing, on a book. This is this one. This is not advertisement to get rich, because that's an open access publication. The Swiss National Science Foundation has generously provided a subsidy so that this book, published with Cambridge University, could be published open access, which I like very much, because every person in the world who happens to have the bad idea to be interested in this kind of research can just look at it. So if you're interested, you can download it. But you can also get a paperback if you want to, and even in that case, don't worry, I'm not getting rich. So thank you very much again.
Professor Mahlmann, many thanks for your presentation. It was really, really rich, really sophisticated. And it seems to all of us, I think, that you are facing a battle in many different fronts
True.
which is always hard. So I would like to invite the audience to make any questions. So we have there, here. Okay, right. So se ele quer as perguntas de uma vez ou
As you like it. What is better? Whatever you feel like.
So, Professor Mahlmann, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was really almost fun to watch and not exactly boring, as you tried to say in the beginning that it would be. I think it was very stimulating. And my question would be something like, you propose some images in your presentation that are really strong to me. I think about the image of the people helping someone who fell in the river as an opposite of the last image of the blind helping other blinds and falling in some pit. And it make me think about, if you would, I think you agree that both the actions of leading some other people is an intentional action. We can choose to help or not. And even when we choose to help, we can make mistakes with this action of helping others. And I think about what would you say about how the theories of mind in the 20th century helps us develop some theory of rights that think about these questions. I think about the authors that deals with the question of mind in a more dialogical than a solipsist or individualistic way, such as Charles Taylor, Elizabeth Anscombe. So first, would you agree more with these theories of mind? And second, if so, does it lead to an anti-individualistic theory of human rights? Because if it's for them to act well, to develop rationalities as something of a more social and dialogical way of development, the mind is not something given, although we have some innate capacities. And for me, this leads to a view of rights as learning to act well as something that we must learn and cultivate and develop in society, in the community, if policies, if it is necessary. So would you agree with this more dialogical vision of human identity and mind? And do you think that it leads to a more non-individualistic or more communitarian or more even perfectionist view about human rights, or how to develop human rights in our society? That'd be my question. Thank you.
So, say something? Okay, it's a very complex question, so I mean, but I obey your orders. So the chair says we should wait. So yeah, I mean, I can do that. I think perhaps it makes sense because perhaps we have forgotten the question, and when we have heard another three. And thank you very much. I would just first of all say that none of the conclusions that you said are irreconcilable with some kind of perspective that doesn't subscribe to the specific philosophical ideas of Charles Taylor or Elizabeth Anscombe. So that is, I think, is important, and I, to a certain degree, think we should get a bit out of, let's say, identifying the problems too quickly with some more or less prominent voices in this debate and look again at the problems themselves. And that is what I at least try to do. I'm full of great respect, but I also think that there is a phenomenon that we have to explain. And as you may have guessed from what I do here with history, it's not an element of justification, but it is what I would like to call saving the explanandum. Clarifying what the phenomenon is that we have to explain. And that is my starting point. The next point is that as far as the moral cognition and psychology is concerned, it's pretty much an empirical question. So there is no a priori reasons why human beings should be A or B. It's a question what they are. And we are trying, as serious scientists, try to find out what that is. I would say since the last 200 years, a certain paradigm has risen, which is the idea that human beings are blank slates and history writes everything on it. And I think that paradigm, I would submit, is dead. It's just irreconcilable with what we know about psychology, and not only and primarily in the field of moral concepts. So there's overwhelming evidence that that is not true. So and then the question, interesting question, which I try to, in my modest means, try to answer is what that is the case, whether that is the case or not. So that is about what you mentioned in your question as perhaps a given innate endowment. I think that is what you said. But that can be pretty rich. And I think that's the first main point I want to drive home, that it can be very rich, and that is empirically interesting, but also normatively interesting. Because if you admit that, you are on the way, on the high road to a radical egalitarian epistemology. Because you have a strong scientific argument why human beings have basically, qualitatively, the same kind of insights. So these Herero were, contrary to what the general staff of the German army thought, not savages. They were human beings in a certain cultural framework, as richly endowed like you and I am. And then, if you have said this, you can ask, I think, the question you were concerned with, which I think are too rashly associated with these other questions I'm just describing. Namely, how do we get a human rights culture that is working? You know, I'm also doing practical law. I'm occasionally litigating constitutional cases and stuff like that. And one of the things that I am not tired to emphasize is that there's a long way from certain moral intuitions to a technical right, even in ethics, and even more so in law. And that is, again, important for what you said, you know, whether we have to cultivate it. We certainly have to cultivate it. That is why I'm with a certain passion. You may have realized that Swiss law professors have limited amounts of passions. And of course, you know, Brazilians have a much higher potential for that. But within my framework, I fight with a certain amount of passion for exactly that, namely that intellectual elites around the planet do not give up on the idea of human rights. So that is part of this cultivation. But that doesn't mean that they are communal or ontologically wedded to a community or these kind of things. These are all too rash conclusions. They are not necessary conclusions, I think. And I certainly think, as I also said, that from this perspective, you can have a very strong idea about community, which I think is the natural outcome of that. Where possibly, and that's my last remark, where possibly would disagree with some of the authors you said, is that the perspectives on human rights are somehow, in a strong sense, defined by cultural communities. And I would say that is most probably proven even in this room. You may share certain background assumptions and cultures. You all may like feijoada or, I don't know, a certain kind of sport or whatever. But I'm sure in this room there are very different opinions about what human rights are about and what are the concrete things about it. So I think, and that is the point here, there is a, I think, strong universalist perspective that transcends communities, and I think is a really realistic account of what communities really are. But to repeat this again, we have to get out of this simple dichotomy of individualism and community orientated. I think that's a caricature of the complexity of the issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. It was great, the presentation. And my question is regarded to a famous study called A Defense of Abortion from Judith Jarvis Thompson, where she defends that no pregnant woman should be forced to make an extraordinary sacrifice and lead the pregnancy to its term if it were not her wish to do so. So she argues that no legal framework demands of people altruism. No legal framework demands that people be good Samaritans and do such sacrifices in order to help others. And she bases her argument, her defense of abortion in that notion. So I would like to ask that, taking that into account, the framework you presented, which bases itself in altruism, would defend the criminalization of abortion, and more broadly, what do you think would be the practical consequences of this framework and the focus on altruism in other, sometimes more difficult to think rights?
Yeah, first of all, this account is not based solely on altruism. As I said, it's based on the idea of justice. It is based on altruism. That's all not very original. I think that's, I think any serious thinker in the history of ideas who thought about morality came up with some kind of account of justice and altruism. And importantly, and that is the case that you are referring to, dignity. And as you may remember, I also mentioned as one of these basic principles, non-instrumentalization. And Judith Jarvis Thompson, which you were referring to, made her argument with the so-called famous violinist case. And that is, the argument is about non-instrumentalization. So that just to clarify that that is not the picture that I painted here. What it would mean for an ethics, I have never heard of any such ethics that is just based on altruism. I don't think it exists. It would be very stupid to even think about such a thing. Would be the outcome, I don't know. But if you are taking seriously, and by the way, and then perhaps I should say that, I don't know how familiar with this. You are all familiar with the trolley problem. Everybody's familiar with it. You're also familiar with the fact that it is one of the most tested empirical experiments that is around. Perhaps the ultimatum game is equally or more tested. And one of the strange findings of this trolley problem is that this prohibition of non-instrumentalization seems to be a cross-cultural universal. So in a certain sense, human beings are, in the deficient terminology of some legal philosophers, Kantians. Of course, Kant didn't invent this principle of non-instrumentalization. That's a joke, also widespread, but obviously wrong, and you will all know that. So this intuition of non-instrumentalization has apparently deep roots, which doesn't mean that it's right, it just says it has deep roots. So, and if you, as far as I'm concerned, any argument about some kind of, I don't know how you call it, liberal account of abortion, let's say, let's call it for a second the standard European approach to abortion, namely a measured, regulation, sometimes with criminal sanctions, sometimes not, time sensitive, sensitive to the development, has obviously much to do with that, because the main argument also in constitutional law for that kind of regime is the dignity of woman. Namely, and that's also Judith Jarvis Thompson's point, that they shouldn't be instrumentalized for procreative purposes. I belong to the group of people who think that is not the whole of the story, though there's also, I don't think prenatal life is just a piece of cut off fingernail. So that is a concern we have. But the basic point, which led to a regime of abortion I personally support, namely this kind of so-called, I call it now, European standard model, was the slow discovery of the dignity of human being, of woman, and the prohibition of instrumentalizing them for procreative purposes. And that's the core of the argument. So I would say, I mean, as I try to emphasize, there's no shortcut from this kind of more foundational research to these concrete questions. But I would say it lends support to what I would regard as some kind of humane regulation of this indeed very problematic constellation that exists.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm sorry for not having read your book. I guess maybe my question will be answered on the book, but
all questions are answered in this book.
I'm sure. Anyway, as I understood from the lecture, I think you claim some kind of universalism of human rights and a kind of belief that human rights could be implied even in discourses of people who do not possess the language of rights, if I understood correctly. So my question is how you respond to the claims of some anthropologists that the very notion of individual is highly contingent. I'm thinking of someone like Louis Dumont in France or Clifford Geertz in the United States. I ask that because if we think that the notion of individual is fundamental for the notion of subjective rights and consequently of human rights, how could we still say that there is this kind of universalism I understood you're presenting there? Would you say that people from those cultures are somehow confused on the way they present their own convictions on what is just, what is right?
Thank you very much. That's an interesting question, and that is one sub-problem of a wider kind of thesis that is around, and that is very much to do with the paradigm that is almost, for some people, a dogma. And this dogma is that there is no kind of species character, well-defined species character. That is, we are fully a product of whatever influences culture. And that is a thesis that you find in the, let's say, politico-philosophical left. Karl Marx, sixth thesis of Feuerbach, human nature is nothing but the ensemble of social relations, kind of a dogma for some people on the left. But you also find it on the right in the same century. You all have read Nietzsche, I guess, his idea that human beings are what he called the nicht festgestellte Tier, the kind of animal without a fixed nature. And you find it very widely proposed. Another influential voice is this Weird, that this research is all just about Western college students in the US. And as I am respectful of empirical findings, my first answer is this could be. We just have to look what the evidence tells us. And now it's notoriously difficult to actually study, of course, what people are like in the past. It's also difficult to study how people are now. And my experience with this is that I think sometimes this dogma overwhelms the empirical evidence and the perception of what is really going on in these societies. One problem often is that people look at explicit manifestations or something of that sort and come up with rather wide-ranging conclusions about it. To take an example from Europe, from current times, just to illustrate what I'm saying, I refer to totalitarianism. The interesting thing of totalitarianism is that it's not only a regime of repression, it's also an ideology that motivates people for self-sacrificial action. So the slogan is kind of that the whole is the totality, the whole is everything, and I'm nothing. So if now a scientist from Mars comes to Nazi Germany in 1940, when the German army was still winning, and would come to the conclusion, oh, there's this interesting species which has no concept of individuality, this person would miss a very important thing. So the proper really way to research these things is to look at how the individual development of children, for example, in different cultures is, and whether they really don't have a concept of individuality, or whether something else is going on. And that would be my proposal, namely a world interpretation that may come to the conclusion that you have to overcome the self, that the self is not all, that there are other dimensions of that. And in philosophy, you all will know examples of exactly this kind of philosophy. And that is one of the things that I find good about my book, is actually that it proposes to look at human history from the lens, just try it out, of a new paradigm that takes the point seriously that human beings may have a species character, and that we are on the way to find out how this species character actually looks like. This front picture was very consciously selected. If I have one more minute, I tell you what it is about. It is a very interesting, actually, document in more than one dimension of rock art, prehistoric rock art in Northern Africa. It's an aquarelle, it's a painting of an anthropological expedition, strangely enough, from a German anthropological institute. It was painted by a female painter called Elisabeth Pauli. It was a female painter because female painters were cheaper. So the guy who led this expedition had lots of female painters, good ones, who painted these things because he wanted to have documentation. It's very important. This picture made it in 1937 to the Museum of Modern Art in New York as a document of, what is important for modern art in generally, namely the realization that prehistoric art was avant-gardistic. And this picture I chose, unfortunately the grants were granted because it's, for me, a symbol for a question I have. Isn't that telling us something important about our species character? These people were very different to us in many ways, but they had the same intimate desire to create beauty. And they did it in a way that speaks to us. And that seems to indicate that there is perhaps more unity of the human species than, let's say, this dogma that I described tends to believe. And just one last cautionary remark about anthropology. Lots of the stuff is tainted by, let's say, discriminatory prejudice, namely the assumption that I just try to criticize, and I'm pretty passionate about, that these people are sort of different and perhaps less developed or something of that sort. So that is another cautionary remark I want to add to that. You're not allowed.
Thank you, Professor. Your lecture was really great. It was really interesting to hear. And my question is about what do you think about the recent advancements in neurotechnologies and all these things that can, how can I mean, can affect, if they can affect and have an impact in our cognitive process, and if these technologies maybe if they can violate our own freedom of our own mind, or they can be helpful to maybe understand ourselves better. Like I saw the quote of John Locke, how he said that similar to our eyes, and the understanding can't understand itself. So what do you think about this? If these neurotechnologies can be more helpful, or they can be a threat to our human dignity?
So I guess you're talking about something like Neuralink, Elon Musk, and or human enhancement, these kind of things. Well, I would say one of a fair assessment of the state of affairs in many respects, as far as these higher cognitive abilities are concerned, is that we don't have an idea how it works. There are all kinds of assertions that we have understood something, and that's a way to sell books. So if you say we don't know something, it's much less attractive than coming up with far-reaching assumptions. But if that is a fair assessment, and I think it's a fair assessment, the prospects to really alter something in our cognitive machineries are dim. And also artificial intelligence is not intelligence. It's something very different. There are lots of dangers. There are also much of possibilities, but also lots of dangers. But so I would say that won't change much about how we really are. But it may change something about how we perceive ourselves to be. And that is my rather problem, the problem that I have, is that false assumptions about ourselves may have very detrimental consequences. So if you are, for example, of the opinion that we are just these blank slates, as you indicated, that anything can come out of us, you may think that some kind of authoritarian ideology is less a danger than other people may assume, who think that there is perhaps some kind of core of humanity you shouldn't violate. So that would be my real problem. I think I know there's a huge debate about human enhancement, and ethicists, applied ethicists talk about it, but I'm not sure that is really the issue here. There's also the normative question, which direction should enhancement take? Should it make us utilitarians? Should it make us non-instrumentalization people? This is something that obviously these technologies cannot answer themselves, because they are supposedly designed according to the standards. So I think, continue to be left with the responsibility to take charge of our own fate. And the problem is, I think, that we may overlook that this responsibility exists.
Well, I am Professor Guilherme Assis de Almeida, and Professor of Department of General Theory and Philosophy of Law. It's the second time that I saw your presentation. The first is by YouTube at Faculdade de Direito de Ribeirão Preto. And very interesting approach, because I think you present us the theoretical issue of human rights in a dialogue between disciplines. I do not like this term interdisciplinarity. And so at the title of your book, you use history, ethics, law. And you repeat rights 2 times, mind and rights and human rights. And I think the only instrument of the international law of human rights that you quote is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's refresh the issue of human rights in the field of philosophy of law. So I would like to ask you a question, not just as a professor of University of Zurich, but your actual position of the president of IVR, because I think the possibility to study human rights in this perspective of a dialogue of disciplines is very interesting and very necessary for the field of philosophy of law. And I would like to suggest that there are some thinkings that could dialogue with your idea. That's the capabilities approach of the theory of justice of Matthias and Matthias, and also the book of social theorist, German social theorist Hans Joas, The Sacred of the Person. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much for this comment. I entirely agree with you that this dialogue is important, and that is another of those points. Perhaps all the substantial conclusions are wrong. I happily admit that possibility, even probability, but I do think, and that is one of the attempts really I made with this endeavor, is to increase our consciousness that our legal institutions and concepts and this is just one example, are very complex. And we should study them, I think, from various perspectives that pay due respect to the complexity of the issue. And I think that is, if I may also talk just as a lawyer to lawyers, it's something we also have to do if we want to defend our own subject in a wider scientific context. There are in the book some remarks on the capability approach, which I think is helpful to delineate in a way to flesh out the idea of equality of opportunity. But I think both in Martha Nussbaum and in Amartya Sen, some things that I think are important are not fully spelled out, including a more precise statement of the normative principles that I think are relevant. But I have no problem with the capability approach. I think it has a substantive contribution made for me, especially to spell out what freedom of opportunity really means. Well, Hans Joas, I had a discussion with him once about these issues, and he also appears in the book, his book appears, and what he does is try to produce what he calls an affirmative genealogy. The problem I have, I mean, he does this because he thinks ultimately there is no argument for the truth or justification of any normative statements. So in a way, he kind of tries to base his argument then on a genealogical development. I don't think that works because, you know, you have to evaluate a genealogical development. And for that, you necessarily need normative standards. And he implies these normative standards. He wants to define human dignity. I'm all with that. But that doesn't help you that you just say, okay, people fought against slavery. There may be people say, oh, well, I read Aristotle and he convinces me that they are naturally born slaves. So you need a normative argument. And I think his tactic to circumvent this problem is, for me, not convincing.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I liked very much. And I am Maria Paula Dallari Bucci, a professor of theory of the state. And it was intriguing at the beginning of your lecture. You were kind of refuting arguments that seemed anti-human rights. And I wondered, is there anyone embodying this kind of argument? Is there an organized thinking against the human rights in that terms? And my question is about this because I see the extreme right, they do not challenge human rights. They are trying to appropriate themselves of the correct interpretation of human rights. This is the kind, for instance, of the free speech right. They say they are the true, they are the true defenders of free speech. We could tell the same about the pro-life right. They are against abortion, on the whole package of the ideological rights, anti-abortion, pro-family, so-called pro-family rights. So I don't feel they are challenging human rights. I feel they are appropriating, they are making a semantic torsion of human rights. Is that right? Do you agree with this?
Yes, I would absolutely agree. I think that is definitely one part of the story. And that leads sometimes to the, as far as I'm concerned, unfortunate consequence that which often happens in the history of politics and ideas, that people who are opposed to what you call the extreme right think, okay, we also have to abandon human rights because naturally they are a tool of those people. And you found this in social history at the core of many political tragedies, I think. So I totally agree with that is a problem. But there is also, and that is kind of my line of attack here, to a certain degree. It's not just against something, it's mainly for something. But it is against the background of a very strong recent human rights revisionism in various quarters. Some of the most influential texts in human rights theory are written by people who basically think we should get rid of it, where they sometimes, because of parochial North American linguistic use, think human rights are just international human rights, as in human rights under international law. Whereas I guess everybody knows that human rights are crucially protected by constitutions. You know, there are citizens' rights, but there are also human rights protected in constitutions, and not only that, also in regional things. That exists, and that is also true for psychology. If you read, according to my spies, a standard textbook in psychology at an elite American university, you will learn what I'm criticized here as cutting edge insight in moral cognition and appreciation of human rights. You know, one shouldn't exaggerate these things. I'm the last one who exaggerates, but I think it is clearly the case that these things exist. And it's also the case that there are think tanks, consciously created think tanks, which not only appropriate human rights, but also weaken human rights in all kinds of respects. You know, there is, just to give you one example, which I think was entirely unimaginable 10 years ago, sort of discussion about leaving the European Convention of Human Rights. England now again concretely because of this Rwanda deportation scheme. And that is all, I think, an offspring of that. So if you had asked me 10 years ago whether I'm worried about that, I would have said no. But at the moment, and giving the general political framework and what is perhaps at the horizon, the problems we will have, I do worry. So I totally agree with you. That's not everything, but I do think it merits our attention, not least because it comes from different political quarters, which is also perhaps nothing new, but something that is in a way reproduced today, and I don't think it helps us, and it's I think important to address it really on the foundational level that I try to do it. But I repeat myself, this is not just I could tell you an anecdote, but I might hear on a video. I will tell you the anecdote later about some reactions on this book. It's not just not primarily a book against something, but it's a constructive theory. That is the core of it. I think mildly innovative constructive theory, most probably wrong, but at least an honest attempt to get on a bit, you know, while respecting perhaps perspectives that are not dogmatic. Who stayed here was paid for staying on till the end.
So I think that's pretty much it for today. I would like to once more thank you, Professor Mahlmann, for being here today. It was a pleasure to hear you and to engage with you. And I think it shows because it's lunchtime and everyone is still here. So unless I start violating people's rights of having lunch, I would like to end up the session today. Many thanks, everyone, and many thanks again, Professor Mahlmann.
Thank you for having me.